Hey everyone, in this snippet, we are going to talk about how an HTML and CSS interview might look like. We are going to work on the YouTube UI and see if we can implement a mock layout within 30 minutes. So stick around till the end to hear tips and tricks on how to best prepare for an interview like this. So, why is this a good HTML or CSS interview question? Well, there's multiple points to that. The first thing is that, as you can see, this is a real world application. Whatever company that you join as a front end developer, you're probably going to be asked to implement something similar to this, or they have a product already that looks like this, right? And the next point to that is that the grid design that you're seeing, it's very common. There's multiple features or columns that have separation of content and purpose in the page. So seeing if a candidate can implement something like this is, usually a good test in an interview. Then the next thing is that you can see that there's so much variety of elements and styles on the page, right? There's buttons, lists, images, text. So this is a good test to see if the candidate has a good base knowledge of their HTML elements and CSS styling. In addition to that, you are going to be writing a good amount of HTML and CSS here. So it's a good time to see if the candidate has good way to organize their HTML and at the same time their CSS. Now, lastly, but definitely the most important part is that there's no way you can implement this in the span of an hour or 30 minutes to an hour, right? So the most important thing here is clarification and the conversation that you have with your interviewer to see which components and which parts of the page actually matter and they want you to work on throughout the whole process, because that's part of the interview, is to see if you are able to figure out and clarify and converse with them in terms of the design and how you will implement it. With that, let's transition to some clarifications. And by that, I mean, what are some of the questions that I will ask when I face this in an interview? Number one, which parts of the UI should you focus on? And like we said earlier, there's too many things going on in this page. There's no way you can finish it in an interview or in an hour, right? So figuring out what the interviewer actually wants you to implement and making a list of those and making sure that that's where you put your focus on. And so we're going to show kind of like what we're going to do with this UI later on in the wireframe that I drew and what we're going to work on in the code. Number two, well, how responsive should the design be? And by that, I mean, how many types of devices would you support with your implementation? Because like we know, everyone kind of views and consumes content in their phones, in their tablets, and in desktops and all sorts of other devices, right? So it's important to know that responsiveness is a requirement or not in this problem, because that totally affects how you might position your elements, how you might create and organize them, versus if it's just maybe focusing on like a desktop version like we have here. And for this one, we're going to just focus on the desktop version. Number three, are there any specific fonts or colors or sizes or pixels that I'm supposed to follow when I'm implementing this design? So this is a good question, because first, if they say yes, then you don't have to worry about all of those things, right? You can just apply them in your styles. But if they say no, that means, okay, they want to see how you will organize your paddings and margins and figuring out kind of like what's your thought process going into this. So with that, we're going to say that they're not giving us any info. They want us just to design this as best as possible as we can. So those are some of the sample questions I would ask in terms of clarifying the problem set. And with that, let's jump on into creating a wireframe or a skeleton of the UI that we will implement. So let's say that after clarifying with our interviewer, this is the wireframe or the main sections that we will implement. So let's go over each part or feature of this page. First, we have space for the navbar, as you can see here, right? And then we necessarily don't need to put anything in there. We just want the space here. As you can see, we have the main video section right here. We have the video details. And then we have a list of the comments, right? And in the list of the comments, we just need to pay attention to things like having the photo of the user and then having their name and the text. And then in here, we have the suggested video section. We have a thumbnail and then also the details of the video right here. Okay, so what I did here is basically, and this is something that you can do in your interview, either in paper or in a whiteboard or anything, that you can basically create some kind of a skeleton or a wireframe of the main components that you're going to implement in your interview so that it kind of serves as your guide, right? When you try to implement, you have a checklist that you can look into and look at, and also, your interviewer can agree on if this is what they want for you to accomplish during the amount of time they give you. Okay, so let's go and start actually working on the code. Okay, so first things first, we have obviously two files that we're going to work on, an index.html and a styles.css. What we have here is in the head part or section of index.html, we obviously load our style sheet, styles.css. So the way we're going to do this is, like I said, we're going to first create a skeleton or a scaffolding of the whole page, of the whole UI, right? We're going to mark basically or try to create a grid with a left side and a right side. And that's what I'm going to be showing in the next few minutes over here. So here's the code. As I type, I'm separating the left content and the right content into two divs. That is also contained within a bigger container div. Container will act as everything that's in the content outside of the header bar. The first thing I created is a header div, right? That's going to reflect kind of like the banner where the YouTube logo goes, and the menu button, so on and so forth, which we're actually not going to implement any of that functionality. We're just setting up a container for that stuff. One thing that you're going to see that I'm going to be doing for every container that I create or every big section that I create is I give them a background color. The reason for that is that I want to be able to visually see, the space that div or that container occupies, right? I give it width and height, basically dimensions, just to visualize, okay, this is, instead of just white color or white space, right, I can actually see the amount of space it takes and the content inside of it. Okay, so as you can see here, I gave the header a blue color. I also tried to reset the paddings and margins inside our body tag by giving it a padding 0 and margin 0. One thing that I started doing on this section, looking at the CSS, right? I started to comment out my CSS. I put a comment that says common classes, meaning these are classes that are not really specifically assigned to any section or any element, right? It's just a class, basically a section of classes that I'm going to use to apply common styles to either divs or text or anything like that. So I'm going to put all of that in this section. Now, in this scenario, I'm using flex boxes, right, to kind of have a responsive design in terms of how my container adapts or my UI adapts as the screen size changes. Remember, we don't really care much about, at this exercise, mobile responsiveness, right? We're going to assume the viewer is going to be mainly using desktop, and we're only basically creating our design to adapt to different desktop sizes. So the screen width and height will still be pretty big, but we still want it to be flexible, right? To be able to take into account a smaller screen size or anything. As you can see, I've given the left content and the right content a 3:1 ratio. That you can see by giving the flex 3 and flex 1. Basically, I'm giving it a 3:1 ratio in terms of sizing. And then after I created my left and right content, now I'm focusing on the inner content within those containers, right? So on the left side, I've started to add a video container, the one that holds the actual video, the video details, which is the name, the author, and basically the amount of views, right? And then the comments, right? And that's also a section on the left side of for content, which basically will hold all the comments for the video. Again, you're gonna see kind of like colors, a lot of colors that are just big blocks of rectangular things as I kind of visualize, right, what the layout actually looks like. I see, and looking at my CSS, you can also see that I'm adding in more comments to just to separate, right, which classes correspond to which sections of the page. This is specifically helpful for you organizing and looking for those classes, in your style sheet. Obviously, when you're working on a big application, it might look different. You're actually going to have different files to represent different styles that might be attached to a specific feature or might be attached to a specific page. But right now, we're only concerned about one page, one big layout. And so having one style sheet is enough. So now at this point, I am starting to fill in the containers one by one. For example, I'm tackling the video details page, right? Or sorry, not page, section, adding in the title, the author, the count, right? I'm working on styling them a little better, a little nicer than just throwing out some text there, right? Something that can be a little bit closer to the mock that were shown and to the wireframe that we created. And basically, that's going to be the next step here, is that after you've created your layout, as you can see here in our HTML page, right, in the browser, that there's already the left and the right content, the video section, the title section, the comment section, and also we have the video suggested video section. One tip I can give you, as you can see, I'm having values in terms of, pixels or sizing in terms of spacing, right? Whenever you're creating a mock like this, obviously when you're working already, there's going to be a designer that gives you these values. But when you're doing it by yourself, stick to kind of a set number of amount. Don't have too much variability in terms of somewhere like 6 pixels or 8 pixels or percent wise, right? Basically pick a number and then just multiply it to adjust the size, right? In terms of, hey, do I want big paddings or margins or smaller paddings or margins? For me, I stuck with like, okay, I'm gonna stick with multiples of 6, right? So you will see in my CSS that everything's going to be like either 6, 12, 24, something like that. Things that are multiple of 6 that it's easy for me to remember, right? And basically I don't have to think about much, right? If I need some kind of small spacing, I use 6 pixels. If I need a big spacing, I use 24 pixels or something like that, right? So 4x that. So that's one tip I can give in terms of coming up with those pixel values or sizing. So now that we're working on the comments, right, and the comment list, and you're gonna see the same in the suggested video list, right? I'm using an unordered list element here, right? So I'm not gonna just keep using divs. I'm also thinking about, okay, a semantic approach to this, right? And obviously a list can take in many forms. It doesn't have just to be a list that starts with a bullet point or a number or anything like that, right? So with CSS we can style a list however we want. So I'm using the UL element, and then basically I'm gonna have each list item be styled as if it's gonna hold kind of like the comment details, right? And so that's what you're gonna see me doing here. It's totally valid that in my LI I have a div block, and this is going to be kind of representing the different elements or becoming like containers for the photos and then for the text and all of that. One thing you might notice here as well is that my use of the common classes. For example, container flex row is a class that I created that simply groups up the common style of what does it mean to make a flex box, right? Like a parent flex box. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Like when you're writing CSS, one thing that your interviewer might be looking at is, are you actually keeping your code dry as well, right? Your CSS dry. So at this point in time, now that I have, one look of one comment, I'm now copy pasting that block of HTML code just to emulate what it looks like to have, a list of comments, right? And as you can see here, I'm looking at my styling. Okay, it's like, what does it look like if there's two comments? I wanted to give it some border. I wanted to give it more padding at the bottom, or margin at the bottom, So that's what I'm messing around with here, is to have, when there's actually multiple elements in there, right? It's important that you test that out. Okay, what does that look like? And it's important that you also look at figuring out giving specific CSS, like I'm doing here, when it comes to the last element of that list, or the first element of that list, right? What I did there was, on the last child, I removed the border, right? Because we don't want a border to show up on the last child of the list. So now the next thing to work on is our write content. So these are going to be like the suggested video section. We are going, like I said, going to do kind of like the similar structure here, an unordered list. And it's going to be a bunch of LIs that are going to be styled like divs to hold the image, mainly the thumbnail, and then the quick video kind of description, which is basically the title, the author, and the amount of views. So that's what I'm working on right now. So around this stage, I see kind of like the whole, list item forming already. We have a space for our thumbnail, and then we have basically copied, right, the HTML that we had for the video details, the main video, but we just changed the elements, right? Lowered down those header elements to H3 and H5. So it's a much smaller kind of font size. And now I'm just kind of messing around with the paddings, the margins, the alignment of the elements. And then the next step is, once we've got a good single item of a video, suggested video item, then we obviously duplicate that and see what the, having 10 of them looks like, right? Or 5 of them. So that's what I'm doing right here, looking at what that thing looks like, and if it needs some padding or spacing around it to kind of give it some, some space between them. As you can see, at first they're all nested on top of each other, and that's why I like having this background colors. Even though I know I'm going to remove them, it gives me kind of that visual feedback that, hey, my elements, could use some space, or where does it begin, where does it end, right? It's kind of like a visual representation of the box, right? The CSS box system, right? It shows us kind of like the amount of padding we have, the border, and the margins and all that. And at this point, we are pretty much done. This whole process took me about 30 minutes to write all of the HTML and CSS. And it might seem like it's a lot of code in general at first, but the HTML, you can see we copy pasted some list items to simulate and see what the long list looks like. And then when it comes to CSS, we group together common stylings, right? That's the CSS best practice. So yeah, there you have it. I will put this in a code sandbox, and you should see the link down in the description. So there you have it. This is a sample HTML and CSS interview. And before we end this video, here are the tips that I promised in terms of preparing for this. Number one, it's the most obvious one, which is to keep practicing, right? As you can see here, we implemented and mocked the YouTube UI. So just look at the sites that you visit the most every day. Try to duplicate their dashboards, their home pages, right? With HTML and CSS, create the components and see if you can mimic them as best as possible. Number two, You don't have to memorize every single HTML element, attribute, or CSS property out there. It's okay that you forget. I think the most important part is that you know that it's possible to create a specific style or effect with CSS, and it should be, your interviewer should be pretty lenient in terms of helping you out and remembering what that property is or giving you a hint towards that. Number three, it's about HTML and CSS best practices. Get to know them. There's a ton of resources out there with just a quick Googling to see, if you're supposed to be putting a div element inside a span, or how can you organize your CSS classes better so that specific styles are encapsulated and reusable, right? So your interviewer will be looking at this stuff. So do some quick research on the best practices on writing HTML and CSS. And that's it. Please don't forget to leave a comment below if you like this video. Any thoughts on it, I would love to know. And so with that, I'll see you next time.